Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Friendship Quilt Along. Today, I am quilting block number 1 on my long arm, and this is going to be a super simple design. I've decided just to quilt stippling over the stars. Now, I'm going to have to break thread a few times and advance the block through the long arm because I don't actually have enough space to quilt this in one pass. So, let's get on the machine. I'll show you how this is going to work. So I don't have very much batting area over here, but I still like to do a little bit of stitching just to check in on my tension. And the first thing I do is I feel the fabric, the backing fabric. I also stitch all the way down to where my ruler plate hits up against the bottom of the frame. And that way I know that's as far as I can stitch on this block before I have to stop. So this is a really good habit to get into. Just roll that over a little bit, take a look at your stitching. Usually if there's a bad tension issue, like if I've missed a guide on my machine, then I can feel it and I can feel the little bumps of the thread and I know that something's off. But this is looking good and feeling good, so we are ready to stitch. So I'm going to break thread because we're going to quilt in the inside of our block and we're going to quilt these stars first. So I'm going to get started here, and I actually am not going to get started right on the point of one of those stars because that is an area of seam allowance and you can actually kind of jam things up a little bit. So I'm going to start about 1/4 inch down, and I needle up, needle down to bring my bobbin thread up to the surface, and then I just take just a few stitches with my needle up, needle down, just so that way it secures the thread. Now my goal is to quilt stippling. It's a wiggly line through the star. I'm going to wiggle all the way through and then end up over here so I can go straight into the next star. So let's see if I can do this. I'm going to go slow, wiggle into this little pocket. Now I'm going to go for that smaller point at the bottom and then kind of wiggle straight into that green one. I'm going to keep this on a relatively small scale because that's a relatively small star. Okay, now I want to be really careful not to work myself into a corner. I want to be able to get out through the tip of this star point. There we go. I'm going to hop across, and I'm basically going to do that exact same design again, wiggling over this area. And you can see this design ended up a little bit different and maybe a little bit denser, but that's okay. I think this looks really good. I don't have to focus on escaping through that point because I know I'm going to run out of space within my frame. So I'm going to stop about right here and quit the machine because here's where I stitched down in the batting area just to see how much space I had to work in. So I know if I hop across and get into this star, I'm not going to be able to stitch, well, more than 1/4 inch of it, honestly. So I know I need to stop right there. So what I'm going to do is pull on my top thread a bit. That gives me a little bit of slack. I'm going to grab my scissors and I'm going to tie off and bury this thread tail. And I just keep a cheater needle here on the machine, really nice and handy so that I can quickly tie off and bury these thread tails. I like to do this. It's a habit more than anything else. And it keeps the block really nice and clean. I can see that quilting design really easily. And it's more than anything else. I feel like this is just a habit that I built on my home sewing machines, and I find it just as important on my long arm. So I just tie that thread tail in a knot, just tie the two of them together, and I pop both thread tails into a cheater needle. It's a self-threading needle. Run that needle through the quilt into the batting later, and my hand is underneath the long arm right now. I have my hand through the top and second rail, and I'm feeling the back of the quilt, making sure that thread didn't pop through to the back. There we go, and I'll do the same thing for this thread right here where I started. And you can see that just takes a few seconds. It really takes no time at all. I keep my tools here nice and handy so I can easily tie off and deal with those thread breaks as they happen. Okay, I've decided to quilt stippling fairly large scale over this entire star. So I'm going to basically pretend that all of those seams don't exist, and I'm going to quilt that stippling on about a 1/2 inch scale through this entire area. So again, I want to avoid the points. The points are kind of a tricky spot to start. Instead, I'm going to pull up my thread right here on a seam line. That looks good. And again, I'm going to just take a few stitches in place, and I am right on the edge. Basically, I pushed the ruler plate right up against my rail, and so I'm on the edge of where I can be. And this is good because it's basically going to give me a guideline across of where I can quilt. So my goal is to go across with a nice wiggly line, or at least maybe to halfway point, and then I might try and wiggle up and come back around. So that's my general idea. Let's see how it goes. So I'm going to come around. Now, I want to quilt on a 1/2-inch scale, and I think it's really good to just keep that scale in your mind by referencing it on something around you. And so I'm referencing my thumb, so I want to kind of keep it so that the lines are about as far apart as my thumb is wide. And also notice that I am trying to avoid hitting points like this that are points of seam allowance. I just want to avoid those areas if I can. Hitting it dead, certainly won't mess up the machine. It's definitely powerful enough to go through it, but it's also just one of those things that's good to avoid just in case. You might break your thread. If it's an area with lots of seam allowances, you might even break a needle. There we go. Now I'm going to wiggle up. I really like the look of that gray thread on these bright fabrics. I think that looks really good. That's Isocord Sterling. I think that's turning out really well. Okay, so you can see how I've quilted through this area. I'm going to stop the machine. Let's talk through it. I started over here, just wiggling around. I was kind of right on the limit of how low I could be in the frame. I was right on the edge, came up and wiggled through this area kind of in a row. I kind of wiggled my way in and wiggled my way out, filling that space completely so I didn't leave pockets in the design, because otherwise I'd have to work my way back in there and fill it in later. So I wanted to fill it in all the way as I go. Now my goal is to do the same thing up in this point. I'm going to wiggle up and wiggle over, and then I'll end up somewhere over here so that way I can advance the block through the machine and keep on going without breaking thread. So let's see if we can get this to work. I'm going to get the machine started again, go straight into a nice curve. And as far as the design itself, there's lots of repeating shapes within stippling, so don't feel like you have to be totally random all the time. You can repeat just these wiggly U shapes. That's perfectly fine. Just add a bend to it every once in a while as space allows, and that makes it more interesting. And then if you can, try and interlock it with the design before. So like right there, I interlocked it with those other shapes, and that makes it look more interesting. Okay, so now I'm going to work my way up into this point. I want to be careful not to basically run out of frame. I want to be careful that I don't get too low. Otherwise, I might end up with a straight line or two, and that would definitely be noticeable within my stippling design. So here we go. I'm going to interlock, just wiggle in and around, and I think I'm going to stop about right here. That looks good. So basically, I need to advance the quilt through the frame, and I'll be able to quilt the rest of that star. So what I'm going to do is pop off my quilt clip. I'm going to open up the ratchet on this lower bar. And now leaving the needle in the down position, I'm going to roll up and advance the quilt through the frame. And I want to go ahead and advance that to the point where basically the back of the foot, I'm not hitting up against that bar, but I'm pretty close. You can see I can stick a finger through there. That's pretty good. And that just allows me to be able to match up with the design that I've stitched before and be able to finish that off. Now, to get all of these layers nice and smoothed out, I'm going to lift up the block and pull it back and smooth out. I also want to double check. Oh, I need to lock that ratchet back for this bottom rail and get that back. And that's about how tight I want it. I don't want it super, super tight. If you get your backing fabric too tight on a long arm, it'll actually cause skipped stitches, surprisingly enough. And that's no fun. So we want to make sure to have just a little bit of bounce in there. There we go, just smoothing that out. That looks really good. Now you might be wondering about stitching in the ditch. You know, am I going to stitch in the ditch around the star? I probably will, but I probably won't do that on my long arm because that is still a little bit of a struggle for me. I will probably move to my home sewing machine and do that stitching in the ditch with walking foot quilting. And I have another video on how to do that posted last week, so make sure to check that out. All right, so I click the machine back on again, and now I'm just matching up with the stippling I did before. So this is gonna look nice and continuous. And just like before, I wanna be able to wiggle in here, wiggle around, but fill in that space completely so that way I don't leave a pocket of openness within that area. That looks good. I'm gonna wiggle down. You notice that I always seem to end up with that really elongated U shape in those points. I think that's a-okay. Please don't panic if you start noticing that you're making kind of the same repeating pattern. No one will notice, I promise you. Also, don't worry if you get a little closer to your line of quilting, if your scale starts to shrink a little bit. You know, especially when you're matching up to another line of quilting and maybe you can't see as well. It's easy to do that. It's easy to get a little bit too close. So I'm just rotating my neck down a little bit so that way I can clearly see that line that I've stitched before and how I want to match up with it. Another thing, don't get confused by the other patches, the other seam lines. It's easy to see something like these seam lines and think, oh, I shouldn't quilt past that, and you know, kind of make a weird shape when you actually can. So always kind of also keep your boundaries in mind and what you're quilting to. And I'm quilting to these outer edges. So I want to go on ahead and fill in all of this area. I'm really liking this. And I'm going to stitch all the way down again to that tip. But not exactly to the tip. Again, that's an area of seam allowance. So I'm going to aim for maybe about a 1/4 inch, maybe somewhere around about here. 1/4 inch off the tip. There we go. That looks good. I'm super pleased with how that turned out. So now I'll pull on that top thread again, give myself a little bit of distance. This just ensures that I have enough thread tail to tie off and bury, and I go underneath the quilt to break the bobbin thread. And I do that for every line of quilting that I do. And then grab that cheater needle, and I use that to help me bring the bobbin thread up too. If I'm not going to tie these off and bury them right this second, then I will just tug on that top thread, bring that bobbin thread up to the surface, and that way I'm sure that that bobbin thread isn't making a mess on the back of the quilt. That is so important. You know, if the bobbin thread's there, you could stitch over it and it'll just get really messy really quick. Okay. So I'm going to tug on that thread, make sure I have a nice long thread tail. We're going to get started again. Let's think about this. We want to be able to knock out these 2 stars, and I want to be able to knock out this whole chain of stars, but I know this is going to be beyond where I can quilt the whole area in one pass. So I think I'm going to stitch this star, and then stop, and then advance the quilt one more time through the machine. So we've got a plan. Here we go. Needle up, needle down. Bring up that bobbin thread, and then I'm going to just drop that needle up and down a few times to get started. That just secures the thread. If you notice that you're having issues, like just having a little knot, maybe the top thread's pulling just ever so slightly to the back when you get started, then just taking a few stitches in place with your needle up, needle down. It's not building up thread, it's just securing the thread together with 1 or 2 stitches close together. They're just kind of tiny micro stitches, and that really works well. Okay, so I've got kind of that pattern already logged in, which is really great. I'm not having to think about this too much. I just swirl in and wiggle over to this first point. Now I'm going to wiggle over to the second point, kind of almost a heart shape there between the 2. Wiggle back through the middle. Now I'm going to go for this lower points here. Make sure that I match up with my design and fill in that area completely, and then come out about right there. And I'm going to stop off that seam allowance Again, if I stop with the needle in the down position and then advance the quilt and do all kinds of stuff, when I get started stitching, it could have a little bit of issue getting started again. So I like to stop off of that seam allowance. Okay, again, let my clamps go. Just roll that quilt block through. Lock the frame down again. Make sure that that is nice and tight, exactly where it needs to be. Now, I am looking at this, and of course we're not going to use the full quilt block here, but this is still cutting it just a little bit close for my taste. So I'm going to need to be careful about that. I do think it's nice to be able to stitch all the way around the block, do a little victory lap, but it looks like I probably need just a little bit more backing fabric, and I'm going to make a note of that in the pattern. If you're working on a long arm, I think you need just a slightly bigger piece of backing fabric. And it could have been, I did not measure this backing fabric, it could have been that I accidentally cut it a little small. That is absolutely possible. Okay, so now I'm going to come in here, wiggle through this star, and this is going to be a different shape. And I think it's just really good to get in the habit of tracing your finger over your path. Plan it out. Know where you're going to go so you don't get lost. This time I'm going to be coming in and then exiting. I could exit through this one or this point. It doesn't matter, either one. So I'm going to come in, wiggle through, come up and around, and then I'm going to try and end through and hop to the next star through that area. So here we go. Click on, hop over that area of seam allowance, and wiggle through those points. And down. I'll be honest, I'm kind of holding my breath a little bit because these are such tiny little stars. I really want to do a good job quilting over them, and it's a little scary. I'll be honest, there's, the tiny little pieces, they were, really time consuming to piece, number one, and then this is a pretty tight version of stippling. So the combination of that is ever so slightly nerve-wracking. So if you start feeling just a little bit stressed out, if you start getting a little short of breath, just take a break. I'm noticing that my stitching got a little bit wild there. I was really close to those ditches, so I'm going to try and bring it in with this next line. If I'm going to stitch in the ditch on my home sewing machine, then I don't need to be all that close to the edges of that star. I'm getting, really, this is the texture, and the stitching in the ditch will do the rest of it. It will make that shape look really nice on the front and back of the block. So there we go. That's looking good. Feeling just a little bit more comfortable now. Or at least I'm breathing a little bit more. It's just a little on the nerve-wracking side because I think the shapes are so small. I don't feel like I have a lot of room to work. I think that must be it, why it's kind of scary. Okay, now I'm coming around. Oops, I just changed up the design just a little bit. Let's see how that's going to change things. I'm going to need to wiggle back into that point that I missed before. So let's see here. I'm going to wiggle down and go all the way to that point, loop around, and then go up to that gray point. That looks okay. Not, perfect, but hey, I think that's great. And then I noticed that I had made that mistake. I wanted to go that direction first before I came down. But, this is the thing. You've got to really just keep an eye on the block. If you notice that you've accidentally missed a little space or lost your focus a little bit, that's okay. Check in. See how things are going. Keep your eye on the block. Looks like I'm a little bit close. I'm going to squeeze through this area and then stop right there. Now, I definitely can try some stitching in the ditch, and I want to just give it a try because, if I expect you to try something new and be brave, then I should be brave too. So here we go. I'm going to just try stitching in the ditch. I've got my ruler foot in place, and I'm using the slice ruler as a guide. And here's the thing that is a little bit of a struggle. I don't have anything to guide the placement of the ruler other than just eyeballing a 1/4 inch away from that ditch. So the reason why it's so easy to hop out is I just really don't have any frame of reference here. I'm gonna place it in place, and then as I start stitching, if I'm stitching out of the ditch, I just have to wiggle the ruler back and forth to get back into the ditch. So there we go. Now, I gotta say, this is a lot better than I expected. So maybe I shouldn't be so afraid of it, or, you know, shouldn't be kind of selling myself short. Oops. See, there we go. See, I just landed exactly in a position of intense seam allowance, and my machine really didn't like that. So I played around with this a few times and experienced this before. So I'm going to pull that straight up and kind of get off that and get started again, and that's okay. I did have a thread break and almost had a needle break once. So I've pretty much learned that those points are a little bit too dense and sometimes can cause some problems. So just watch out for that. You know, hop in, hop out. Try and, you know, hit the point, but then get off it. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot quilting stippling with me over this Scrappy Star block. Now, I want you to know you can absolutely quilt the same design on your home sewing machine too. I've also shared another tutorial with a straight line walking foot quilted / ruler foot quilted design on a home sewing machine. So you have 2 different quilting designs for this one block. So make sure to check out that video at leahday.com/friendship. This is a year-long quilt along, and you can join anytime. You can quilt on a long arm, you can quilt on your home sewing machine, and you can make any size quilt you need, whether it's crib, throw, twin, queen, or even a king. And I'm making the king size version, so every month I'm going to quilt out 2 different blocks, one on my home machine and one on my long arm. So I hope that you'll join in the fun of the Friendship Quilt Along and pick up your block pattern today. You can find it at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt.